many, but this one from Sleeping Lady Vineyard, and would love to hear your thoughts on it.
Well, I'm proud to be here, and thank you for the invitation. It's a real accomplishment that I really feel proud of, but it's mostly because of the people that are around me that gives me the challenge to continue. I want to explain a little bit about my background just slightly, because I'm not a farmer and I'm not a winemaker, but I love wine. And so where I started was a chemical engineer in the oil industry, and I started when I was 25 years old, and with many, many professionals around me and good partners, we grew it into a major business, still on the New York Stock Exchange. But at that point, I wanted to change professions, and I left that profession and tried to decide what the next profession was going to be for me. And I had a restaurant, a wine bar in Denver and Boulder. Colin in the back, who's my manager, introduced me to fine wines of the world. I'd traveled before, but he was so enthusiastic at a young age about wine that I caught his attention and ended up in wanting to go forward in the wine business. So I moved out after retiring from that. I moved out in Sonoma, which is a beautiful agricultural place to live, and decided that I'd have a winery and make wine in Sonoma. And Sonoma's an unusual area, and it's a little bit cooler than Napa. But as I continued to travel and traveled a lot with John Caldwell, I ended up in Europe a lot, in Burgundy and Bordeaux and Italy, Spain, and found these wonderful wines of the world. And so when I came back, I started really getting more involved in Napa and Napa Cabernet. And what drives me about Cabernet is the flavor profiles that vary so much with where the actual vineyard is. So I took off down a different road of deciding to have different vineyards with different winemakers, with each wine really showing the complexity of that vineyard. And so Sleeping Lady is one of those vineyards. What I find interesting in this, whatever you want to call it, terroir or whatever, it's microclimates, it's soil, it's inclinations. There's a lot to be involved. The Sleeping Lady is unusual. It is benchland. It's like Oakville, Rutherford, except in Yountville. It's a continuation of the Mayacamas Mountains that run off. The flavor profile of, say, up on Mayacamas or up on Montagna and Pritchard Hill is much more volcanic. It's it's really decomposed volcanic out of the top of the volcano. There's a lot of rock, a lot of clay, very drying. The soils are thin, water runs off, and so you don't have a lot of moisture. And setting up on the hills, you get intense sunshine, not very much fog in the morning. You get very warm climates, so you get a total different flavor profile. So coming back to Sleeping Lady is laying up against the Mayacamas. It's a lot of rock that ran off the mountains early on when the mountains were really being destroyed. And so you got all these cobblestones left from streams that ran off the top of the mountains. Overlaying that is a heavy clay, fairly wet clay. But fortunately, we have this cobblestone underneath of it that drains. And so you get draining, you can control what happens to the soil in terms of drying, which is really fundamental in how rapidly the vine grows, which determines actually what the flavors are going to end up being, because rapid growth is not as good as a slower growing grape. So, and you get smaller grapes because of it. So that underlaying cobblestone is really important, but the cobblestone needs to drain. I mean, if it fills up full of water, you've still got wet clay. This has a ditch that was put in back during the days when they were farming prune trees on it. Originally, it was planted in grapes back during the Mission, and then it was converted to prunes because everybody liked dried prunes. So down through the middle of it is a drainage ditch that's about 4 foot deep, right in the cobblestones. If you come and visit, when you're driving down the driveway, look at the cobblestones underneath of it. You will see them. They're 3, 4, 5 inches in size, round, definitely river rocks. That drains it, and from that, we've gone the next step. As we replant, we actually put ditches across into that, so all the thing acts like a well-drained property. So drainage is extremely important, even in these benchlands. The topsoil is clay, not real heavy, but heavy enough that it holds back the growth of the vine slightly. And it dries. It stays a little bit cooler. We're up against the Camas Mountains, sloping to the east, which gives us a little different inclination. We don't get quite as much heat from the sun, and then you get the afternoon shade from the Camas Mountains. The afternoon shade allows it to start cooling off early, which means that it now goes into a little bit cooler soil. When the sun comes up in the morning, it's a little bit slower to start. So it's a whole microclimate of itself, with soil, with clay, with under the benchlands. And so it's really fascinating to me to watch those kind of different things going on. And when you get up into volcanic, you end up into much blackberry flavors, a little darker flavors. Well, this down in Yountville is a cooler area. Yountville has the mountain right behind it. It stops the flow of cold air up, so behind it you get warmer weather up, and so you get a little less of that dark flavors and a little more of the red fruit in it. So it's an interesting flavor profile, absolutely totally different than all the other vineyards that we make wine out of. So I really see it as that. In terms of farming, it's all spread vertical, which allows you to have a little more leaf in terms of sunshine. Also gives you a little more shade, so you're not getting so much sun on the grapes themselves, but prevent any kind of raisin or cooked flavors. In winemaking, I rely upon the winemakers to decide, although being a chemical engineer, it's hard not to get involved in what they're doing. Julien Fayard is our winemaker on this particular property. He's more of a classic French winemaker, so his style, I think, matches the property better than Mark Harwood's another winemaker that's here. Actually, you'll have to go by his desk and taste his wines. He's a little more opulent, a little brighter, a little darker fruited. We have a vineyard in Sonoma, which tends to be a lot cooler, a little more red fruit, a little flavor profiles from red all the way to black. So for me, it's really interesting in the farming part of it. And the winemaking is fascinating. Our barrels are about 50% barrels that I actually go to France and buy the timber. We have it cut, we have it dried. We send over a master cooper, the only Hispanic master cooper in the world. He works for me and John Caldwell. He goes over and supervises not the construction of the tank, but making sure the wood is picked right, making sure that it's toasted to what the winemakers want. There's such a variation in, if you buy barrels, they'll vary a lot between who's actually toasting them. If you're lucky enough to own a winery in France, you know the guy that's actually toasting your barrels. In the US, I can't say, oh, I want JoJo to toast my barrels. So I send someone to make sure they're toasted properly. And it means that I don't eliminate some of my wine out of the makeup because the barrel was toasted incorrectly. So I get highly involved in details. Going back to the vineyards themselves, I grew up in Washington. We grew peaches and apples, pears, prunes. But what's most fascinating to me is the variety of peaches, where they were grown, what kind of soils they were grown in, and the flavor profile of the fruit and the smell of the fruit when you walk through. And it wasn't long before you knew which tree you really liked to eat a peach off of. I find wine very similar in texture of the fruit, the texture of the wine, the nose of the wine. And this particular vineyard I love. It's one of my favorites. Rhonda, my wife, this is her favorite wine. So hope
Thank you,
enjoy.
Brian.
Thank you.
That's a great summary. And I think you can